Today we are going to be continuing our discovery of ecology at the community level. If you remember, populations just dealt with one species in an area. Community now takes a look at all of the living things in an area. And so as we continue up our hierarchy of ecology, the community is the next level. And so it's all the populations that live together in an area. And so we're not just talking about just the population of elk, but we're talking about the population of elk, the grass that they eat, the trees that they eat, the insects that pollinate them. And so we really do take another shift in broadening this whole ecology thing. So what makes an area have the life that it does? A lot of these we'll talk about next unit with ecosystem, but we can't talk about community with at least talking about this a little bit. So what the weather is like of an area, what the slope is like, what are the availability of resources in that area, how well have those creatures adapted to their area, are there species that are just found in that area or are they found in many areas, and then also what are the physical disturbances? So does it get tornadoes, does it get hurricanes, does it get earthquakes, volcanic eruptions that might restart the generation process? All those things are part of a community level. So when we talk about communities, one word that we deal with is something called a niche. It's a job or a role that that creature plays in that ecosystem. And so, the feel good of a niche is what we call the fundamental. So let's go grab a polar bear and bring it down to South Dakota. Well, it might be able to live in South Dakota from maybe, let's say, November to March, but then it starts to get hot. Polar bears don't like it hot. Or let's say that we go down to Arizona, we dig up a cactus and we bring it to Michigan. Well, it might be okay in Michigan from maybe, let's say, May to maybe August, September, but then it's not going to be able to sustain life. And so a realized niche is where that creature actually lives and what it actually serves in that ecosystem. A fundamental is kind of the feel good or the possibility of what could take place. And so a little bit of review from what you learned about in previous biology classes. We have what we call symbiotic relationships. Symbiotic means a close association with. So there are three that we have learned previously. Parasitism is where one organism benefits and the other one is hurt or harmed. Commensalism is where one organism benefits, but the other one is neutral. The N there is for neutral, it's not for negative. So it doesn't really care. It's not positively impacted, it's not negatively impacted. And then the last one is mutualism, and that is a plus/plus. That is where both organisms are going to benefit from the association. Other types of species interactions are competition, and that is where you have two organisms that are going to fight over a needed resource. You have inter-specific competition, and that means different species. So that would be like in the African savanna, you might have a zebra, a lion, a wildebeest, and a hippo all competing for the same watering hole. Intra-specific competition are the same species competing over a resource. So this would be like the male lion versus male lion competing for a lioness mate. So those would be the difference between those two words. And then finally, predation is where there's an act of killing or consuming another for food. That's different than parasitism, which is going to be negatively impacting another. So we talked about how predation, you're actually killing or consuming another for food. Parasitism, usually it's negatively harmed and you're not killing them, although sometimes it can lead to that. So let's jump into these relationships a little bit more. So first of all, again, mutualism, a plus/plus. Both organisms benefit. You're seeing the diagram here of what's called a yucca plant and a moth. So moths have a tongue in the it's called a radula, and it's big enough where it can actually get into the nectar of this yucca plant, where a lot of other insects it doesn't work. And so that's they have a very, very close association with each other. It's actually called coevolution, where they both benefit. So moth is getting nectar, yucca plant is getting help being pollinated. Another very famous mutualistic relationship is good old Nemo. So this is a clownfish and an anemone. So a clownfish benefits because the stinging cells of, or stinging nematocysts there of the anemone will actually kill a lot of other fish, but the clownfish has developed a mucus that protects it from getting stung. And the clownfish are actually kind of vicious little creatures. They will actually deter, kind of chase after other fish that try to come near the anemone. So they kind of both protect each other to a certain extent. Um, let's talk about another type of relationship. So here's the competition. So we know that competition happens all the time. Sometimes, in very extreme examples, if two organisms fill the same niche or the same role, one will basically bully the other one. And that's something called interference competition. And so what you're seeing here is you're seeing what's called the least chipmunk and the yellow pine chipmunk. So if they occupy the same niche, sometimes it will lead to what we call competitive exclusion. And that is where one will actually basically leave the area because it just can't outcompete the other. But with this interference competition, what happened is the chipmunks basically found different roles. One became more of a tree dwelling chipmunk, where the other one became more of a ground dwelling chipmunk, and so their diets changed. You can kind of see how these two, they look different from each other. Certainly they have some similarities to each other, but they basically developed their own identity within the ecosystem that allowed them to survive. But if these competition, situations lead to extreme competition, sometimes you can get those that basically are removed from an area, and that's what's called competitive exclusion. And we see this with an experiment that was done by an experimenter, Gause was his name, and what he did is he took two different types of paramecium, and when he grew them separate, of course, they did really, really well. But when they grew them together, you see that the caudatum, that's the one that's in blue, its population really suffered because the Aurelia population outcompeted them. And so this is oftentimes what we refer to as a competition graph, showing that things do really, really well when they're on their own, but when they're grown together, not so fast. And we see this this competition, not just with animals, but also with plants. So here we have three different kinds of plants that can coexist with each other on prairie lands, but the only reason is because they have different root systems. So if you're competing for the same level of soil or have the roots in the same area, you know that bad things are going to happen. That does happen, of course, on Earth. But if you have plants that are going to go after different resources or have roots at different depths, then they can coexist very, very well. And so what we're seeing here, this is the one from the image shown, is that you have the smartweed, which penetrates rather deep into the soil. You have the Indian mallow roots, which is kind of the mid-range. And then you have the bristly foxtail roots, which are at the surface. So these three plants, again, just kind of going back and forth with the slides, these three plants can do very well with each other because they will occupy different root systems in the soil. So that's an example of what we call coevolution, where they have been able to adapt to each other in order to survive. Other examples of coevolution, this is where the relationship is so dependent on each other that they will actually adapt to each other. We see this a ton with a flower and its pollinator, that the flower will change shape or the insect will change shape based on the creature and how they have developed over time. And so that's something that happens with close associations or with those symbiotic relationships. But we also see this with predator-prey relationships. So as snail shells have thickened, the claws of snail-eating crabs have become more massive so that they're able to crack them. So we have talked a lot about how life has two main goals: to reproduce and to stay alive. And sometimes as creatures are trying to stay alive, not only does the prey change, but so do the predators. And so a relationship at the community level that we just talked about are what we call predator-prey relationships. And as these organisms are changing to each other, they're influencing their number. And so a very famous case study that was done was Isle Royale. It's up in Lake Superior with the moose wolf population. But there's also been other studies, as you just saw at this previous picture, with the lynx and the hare. But a couple of things with predator-prey relationships. Number one, they are very cyclical, which means that as one goes up, the other also goes up. But usually it's a little bit later. So in this graph, what you're seeing here is the black is actually the hare population, the blue is the lynx. So you see that the hare population had a really good year right here, but the lynx population doesn't start going up until a little bit after. And then unfortunately, when the lynx population goes up, then we see kind of this crash of the hare population. So these things are always fluctuating up and down. The predator is always a little bit late to the party. But we also notice that, okay, we look at the hare population, what the heck happened there? Well, that might have been a very, very good year for vegetation. It might have been, why is this population down here? Well, as the lynx spiked up, we'd see the population go down. So these numbers fluctuate a lot based on, yes, the predator preys themselves, but also based on the environmental factors that can take place in the ecosystem. And so remember, as we talk about, creatures, they want to survive, everything wants to live, they want to reproduce. We have different what we call defense mechanisms that creatures develop. And so one of the ones that we see in almost every single creature on Earth is some type of camouflage. And just the ability to blend in with their surroundings, basically to not get eaten. We see warning coloration. So a lot of our very colorful creatures, not necessarily birds, but like the reptiles and amphibians that are colorful, oftentimes they carry with them some poisons. Mimicry, something that's a lethal creature gets copied by a non-lethal creature so that that non-lethal creature thinks that it has venom or that it is scary. And then, of course, you have those flight or fight responses, also known as moment of truth. So what does a creature do in the heat of battle? Does it fight or does it fly away? Is it going to defend something or is it going to get the heck out of Dodge? So when we look at some pictures of these prey defense mechanisms, we see this. This is called a bittern. You might think, well, I can still see a bird there, but it actually arranges its neck in such a way that it blends in with the reed grasses that are near usually a lake edge or a pond edge. This caterpillar, although is very obvious to us, a lot of its predators are colorblind, and so it blends in with the leaves. This one is kind of crazy. If I ask, hey, what is this a picture of? You should say rocks, right? Well, not only is it rocks, but there's also, this is a fungi, a mushroom that has developed coloration so that it's actually able to blend in that much better with its surroundings. Mimicry. So here we have a wasp. We know that those have stingers. This is another one, but this doesn't have a stinger, but it has developed coloration so that things think that it's scary. And so that's kind of a unique thing that we see, is that creatures are always evolving with each other to not get eaten. Other examples of defense mechanisms, here we have a beetle that actually will emit a kind of a spray so that it will deter mice from eating it. And there's just you could talk about a whole bunch of these that are able to adapt to their surroundings. But again, collectively, these are called defense mechanisms, was our last topic for this video. We will continue with part 2 in our next video.